Hello, thank you again for volunteering with Griffith Tutoring. Today's video will cover everything you need to tutor the science section of the ACT. In this video, we'll provide an overview of the section and show you how to apply Griffith's right method to this content. The science section consists of 7 sets of scientific information, each followed by multiple choice questions. Students have 35 minutes to answer 45 questions. The information is presented in graphs or tables, research summaries describing experiments, and conflicting viewpoints on a related idea. The questions require the test taker to understand the basic concepts of the provided information, examine critically the relationship between information provided and conclusion drawn, and generalize given information. Questions within each reading passage of the science section start out easier and get harder as students move through the passage. As a general rule, students should try to answer only the questions that come easily to them and save the harder questions for when they have time left at the end. The science portion always has a reading comprehension section that students should skip initially. This is usually a long experiment. When moving through the science section, students should instead prioritize questions that have graphs and tables. Students can usually answer these questions just by looking at the graph or table without having to read the passages provided. So when you start working on the paper test, the first thing you want to tell your student is not to read any passages, but go directly to the questions themselves. You do not need to understand the passages or the purpose of the passages to answer the majority of the questions on the science section of the ACT. You can answer most questions using information in the graph, table, or figure provided. When your student comes to a question, they'll want to immediately start using the right method. For the first step, restate the question. The student should first ask him or herself 3 things. First, like always, they should ask, what is the question asking for? This is the part where they simplify the wording in the question so they can better understand what the question's asking for. The next thing they can ask themselves is, what graph is the question asking about? The questions almost always say something like, in graph 2, or in table 1, or in figure 3. This is usually pretty clear, but you want to make sure your student's making the connection that this is where they need to look. The last thing they can ask is, what are the keywords in the question that I need to find in the table, graph, or figure? These keywords can also often be found in the answers. Something that's really important to know here is that the science section does not test you on the science concept you learn in high school. The ACT doesn't care how you did in biology, physics, or chemistry. It only cares if you can read a table, graph, or figure and answer questions about them. Griffith has identified 5 types of questions on this section. Understanding each type of question and remembering a few helpful hints will be the key to success on the ACT. The different types of questions you'll come across on the science section are graph the relationship questions, comparing graph questions, new information questions, description and analogy questions, and reading comprehension questions. The first and most popular concept the science section tests for is graph the relationship. These questions require you to read a graph that shows a relationship between 2 variables. For questions like these, your students should restate the question, keeping in mind what they might be looking for, and find keywords from the answer or question in the graph or table, and see how they interact. They should try to figure out what information they can pull out that relates to the question and the keywords. Question 7 is a good example. You can restate the question to, what was the net productivity of the land at the end of year 50? The question directs you to figure 1. Keywords here are years and grams per meter squared per year. So now we take a look at the figure. We see what the y-axis of the graph is when the x-axis of the graph is at 50, and we can find that it's just below 1200. That means the answer is D. The next thing your student will be asked to do is compare 2 or more graphs. They may be asked to determine the common denominator between 2 graphs. These questions may require them to use information in the paragraph if they're unable to find information from the graphs provided. Just like with graph the relationship questions, you want your student to restate the question, know what they're looking for, and find the keywords from the answer or question in the graph or table and see how they interact. Have them try to pull out information that relates to the question and the keywords. Question 8 is a good example of this concept. The restatement is, what was the net productivity of the land at the end of year 50? The question specifically says to go to Figure 1 and 2. The keywords are biomass, net productivity, and years. You can see that the common denominator is the time in years. You can also see that the biomass and net productivity are the y-axis on the two graphs. Now you just need to see what happens in both graphs at year 200. Both increased, so F is the correct answer. Other questions will have new information included. These might have new facts, a new theory, or may extend the graph and make an assumption. For these types of questions, find where the new information should be inserted and how that will affect the graph or table. Then, infer how this new information will affect the situation. Let's look at question 17 for an example. The restatement is, what answer graphic shows the comparison between using the heavier weight versus the original weight on the brass? In other words, what would the effect of heavier weight be on expansion? Thinking about this question, you would think that the heavier weight would expand the wire more than the original weight. Is that relationship exhibited in one of the answer choices? Yes, it's D. So you have to make an inference to get the correct answer. The next question type is the description and analogy question. This asks students to describe what's happening in the graph or put in a different form information from a table, graph, or figure. For these questions, students should look to the answers for guidance on scope and subject. Number 5 is a good example of this concept. The restatement here is, which graph shows the relationship between a flood basalt plateau and the rate of lava production? The key words here are age of flood basalt plateau and rate of lava production. The question doesn't necessarily tell you to go to Table 1, but you can look for these keywords and see that Table 1 is where you need to go. Now, you need to line up the two relevant columns. As the age increases, what's happening to the rate production? It goes down, then stays put, and then returns back up. Which answer graph shows this? It's answer B. You're asked to put this information in a different form, and B is the correct way to do so. Last, you'll have the reading comprehension questions, which we mentioned before. These ask about the passage as a whole and should be skipped initially and returned to at the end if there's time. Passage 4 is a good example of this. Skip the passage and return only if there's time. If there is time, use the reading comprehension strategies we used during the reading section for these questions. When you're working with your student or students, have them complete one question at a time. Once they have a handle on the materials and strategies, give them multiple questions to work on at a time before going over the answers with them. Give them time limits to complete multiple questions, knowing they'll have about 50 seconds a question on test day. Like always, you have the answers and explanations, which have the restatement of the question, which identify the commonly tested concept, and explain why the correct answer is right. Remember, for this section, it's critical for students to do 3 things for each question. They should restate the questions, determine which graph, table, or figure they need to look at, and find the key words. Once they've done that, they can line up the information and determine or infer the correct option. That will conclude this video. Thank you again for volunteering with us. As always, feel free to contact me if you have any questions.